Welcome, everyone. We're thrilled that you're all with us. Welcome to the third webinar in Journalists for Human Rights' new series, Information Saves Lives, coordinated in this case by the Indigenous Reporters Program at JHR. JHR has made space in this series to discuss what we believe to be a particularly timely and important topic in the media, the call for meaningful diversity in the newsroom. But first, we do wish to acknowledge the land on which Journalists for Human Rights head office operates and recognize the longstanding relationships that Indigenous nations have with these territories. For thousands of years, this has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and most recently the Mississaugas of the Credit River. Toronto is in the dish with one spoon territory and is home to Indigenous peoples from many nations across Turtle Island who continue to care for this land today. We are all treaty people, and for JHR, this means acknowledging the responsibilities that we all bear to uphold treaties that, misunderstood and neglected as they have been for generations, still govern the land we are on to this day. JHR further recognizes and supports the importance of truth, storytelling, and accurate and respectful coverage of histories and current day events as essential to decolonization and reconciliation. This conversation follows an op-ed published by IRP program lead Megan Fowler and myself in the Globe and Mail, with a call for newsrooms to reflect the populations that they serve and remove barriers to allow for diversity at all levels of the media. The conversation will be led by journalists whose voices and experiences throughout their careers have been highly influential to this movement. The conversation will be moderated by Karen Pugliese, journalism professor at Ryerson, former executive director of news and current affairs at APTN. Karen will be in discussion with Adrian Harewood, co-host of CBC News Ottawa, Anita Lee, media strategist, journalism professor, and co-founder of Canadian Journalists of Color, and Brandy Morin, a French, Cree, and Iroquois journalist from Treaty 6 in Alberta, whose award-winning work is featured in Canadian and media outlets around the world. JHR is a nonprofit. Donations help us to continue this important work. We are grateful to CTV News for their sponsorship of this series, and we ask if you are inspired or moved by what you hear in the coming hour to please consider donating using the donate button on your screen. Now I'll hand it over to Megan Fowler, program lead of our 7-year-strong award-winning Indigenous Reporters Program, to take it away.
Thanks, Rachel. So the Indigenous Reporters Program at JHR aims to increase the quality and quantity of Indigenous stories and voices in Canadian media. We've been busy pivoting our programming to online platforms, so please stay tuned for more information by following our Facebook page, JHR Indigenous, and the hashtag JHR Indigenous on Twitter. And in August, we will be launching a series called Virtual Circles, community forums on media topics from Indigenous perspectives. And we look forward to having you join us in these conversations. Now I'll hand it over to our moderator, Karen.
Thank you so much. I want to really thank Megan and Rachel and JHR for creating this space and this opportunity for us to all be here today. We've promised a conversation about what meaningful diversity in Canadian media looks like and the solidarity movement that's leading the way. But I'd actually like to reverse that and talk a little bit about this solidarity movement and why it's happening. I've got some stats here from the New York Times. They say the movement, although it's still going on, peaked on June 6th with 500,000 people turning out at nearly 550 places across the United States. Pew Research Center estimates 15 million people have joined it between June 4th and 10th. So Adrian, I know the catalyst for this was a very violent death of George Floyd at the hands of police, but this reaction, because these things have happened before, why is this reaction happening now?
You know, Karen, I think it's really hard to say. It's quite a strange alchemy, a confluence of all kinds of different things. We can attribute it to social media. We're living in the social media age. And so social media certainly allows these stories to be passed on very quickly. And so we see the kind of emergence of these transnational movements really around the world. We're living in the middle of a pandemic as well, the coronavirus pandemic. in which racialized people have been suffering in particular ways. They've been suffering disproportionately. And I think that that has also been a factor. It also means that people have more time to engage in these kinds of activities. And I'm thinking particularly about young people. So those are some other, issues that I think contributed to the fact that so many people were moved to respond. I think also, and again, we can't just get away from the vile nature of what took place to George Floyd. Like, it was the murder in plain sight, live on television. This execution really troubled people and troubled all kinds of people, and I think it moved people to act. But it's always difficult to provide a kind of an explanation as to why exactly things happen when they do. I think that this was the spark that led to an explosion, really, of activity, and we are here as a result.
And so the movement does come up into Canada. And Anita, I know that you spent some time covering Black Lives Matter in the US, but you've also been following it very much in Canada. Can you explain what that movement looks like here and how it's being shaped in Canada?
Well, I feel like there was a lot of influence, obviously, from our neighbors to the south, obviously. But I really echo what Adrian said about how COVID has really laid bare systemic inequities in our society. So obviously, we can see, coronavirus is disproportionately impacting African American communities in the U.S. You can see an increase in hate crimes against people of East Asian descent around the world, but especially in North America. And a lot of folks who live in remote regions, including Indigenous communities, have a more difficult time accessing test kits. So it really just, a lot of people talked about COVID as like this great equalizer, but it really just laid bare the fact that there are systemic inequities in society that we have yet to address. And I think that really did accelerate the conversation and provided a catalyst, in addition to the death of George Floyd, for people to really open their eyes. And for me, for people who have been doing this work for a long time, it's not like this has suddenly popped up, including in this country, but I feel like now people are, because of the fact that we have had this time to really take a hard look at our systems and a hard look at how we run society, I feel like this is a reckoning, and hopefully one that will lead to actual solutions.
Can I add one other thing, Karen? Can I also say that we're also living in an age of populism, of rising populism around the globe, and also rising fascism. And I think that also explained the part of the response, like why people felt the need to go out and show themselves. In many instances, it was a reaction against the political climate in which we're living in, and these were acts of resistance as well.
I would also like to add, just for Canadian context, there was a lot of occurrences that led up to this moment, and that included, obviously, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau wearing brownface and blackface, and the reaction to that, the fact that there was like such a polarized reaction between, half of all, like a portion of Canadians being shocked by this, shocked by the fact that this could happen, and then a portion of Canadians feeling like, okay, this is not too much of a surprise, given the daily lived experiences of a lot of racialized people in this country that has gone invisible for a long time, including in a lot of media organizations in this country. And beyond that, there was also an op-ed out of the Vancouver Sun that said, for which they apologized later on, that said that ethnic diversity was harmful to this country, which is really going against our constitution, given that multiculturalism has been entrenched in our constitution for decades now. So there was a build up to this conversation, and I think we're at a head.
Yeah, and I remember that article. It wasn't just saying that diversity was harmful. It was relying on research that actually said the opposite. So it was sort of almost, it was a disastrous decision for the media to publish that. It wasn't fact checked. It was twisting information in a way that made it wrong.
Yes.
I want to go to Brandy now. And I'm going to ask you to answer a question that I know you're brave enough to answer, but there was this moment when Black Lives Matter was coming up into Canada, and a lot of people who are social media influencers were saying, Indigenous people need to be quiet right now and let Black Lives Matter have its moment. And I remember liking those comments in social media and saying, yeah, we should be quiet. And then as it went on for a couple of weeks, more and more we're seeing our chance to connect to this movement. We're seeing things that are happening to Black people that happen to our people. And you came in and you wrote, I think one of the first articles that opened up the space for Indigenous people to join into the conversation. But it wasn't an easy thing to do. And I wanted to, if you just talk about that a little bit.
Definitely. Well, this struggle is a shared struggle from day one between people of color and Indigenous people that live on these lands of America, called America. It's not something that ever been separate or that we've ever been divided upon. We've always been together, supporting each other in solidarity with so many of these struggles. So when I came out and I seen everything that was happening as a result of George Floyd, I was so inspired that so many people were finally getting it, finally seeing and understanding and being outraged, right, by these injustices that are happening. But I also seen many people here in Canada coming out, you know, in support in droves and just being shocked and acting, you know, acting so enraged by what was going on. And I was like, I was kind of stunned by their actions. I was like, this has been going on in our country on so many levels for so many years, in, you know, genocidal levels against Indigenous peoples and peoples of color. And all of a sudden, you know, they're coming on board. And so I was like, where have you been all along this time? And then I wrote about it, and I wrote about how Prime Minister Trudeau was quick to go take a knee at Parliament Hill to stand in solidarity with Black Lives Matter, which is amazing. And it's great that he did that. But it was also, to me, hypocritical of him when he hasn't acted or taken that kind of solidarity with the oppression against Indigenous peoples in this country. And so I had written about that, and I believe that article is, I wonder who will march with Indigenous peoples with that same kind of passion, with that same kind of outreach, and also talking about how, you know, we're in this together, and it's not necessarily one and apart from each other, because I got attacked by, you know, different, I guess, influencers who are Indigenous.
But yeah, our own people. Yeah.
And I'm saying, you know, yeah, like you shouldn't be talking about this, or, you know, be quiet, or you're taking it away from this. And I was having a conversation with somebody and about it. And they said, you know what, that is a colonial construct, that there's not enough room. There's more than enough room for all of us to be having these conversations, because we're in it together and we're supporting each other together. It is the same fight.
I want to go to Anita because I see her nodding there.
Yeah, I I totally agree with what Brandy says. Like, to me, this is a collective effort, and not just on the part of like racialized people in Canada. All Canadians are going to benefit from greater diversity, especially if we're talking about it in the context of media, because storytelling is ultimately what bridges gaps. It's what reduces polarization. I don't actually understand the reluctance or the reticence of a lot of institutions that prevent them from embracing diversity and inclusion, because in such a polarizing time, I think it's incumbent on us, and it's a civic responsibility for us to work on this issue together collectively, because it is to the benefit of all Canadians.
If I can just add, Karen.
I was going to ask you to jump in there, Adrian.
Yeah,
please.
no, just in a very material way. There's been a long-standing relationship between Indigenous peoples and peoples of African descent. You know, even for example, if you look at just 30 years ago, we're marking the 30 years of Ganatsitake, of what it's also called as Oka. You know, that time was a time of solidarity. That was a time when Black communities, Black individuals, Black organizations supported their Indigenous brothers
Wow.
and Indigenous sisters. If we look at, for example, in the Black Power movement in the 1960s, the American Indian movement was very much influenced and had relationships
That's
with
right.
the Black Panther Party and took a lot of lessons from them and vice versa. There were exchanges. And going back to times of slavery in North America, there were also relationships between peoples of African descent and Indigenous peoples, in which Black peoples were sheltered at times by Indigenous peoples. So I think that there's a long relationship, and that relationship needs to be referenced.
For sure. I remember when I was growing up, not to date myself, but I remember Lee Miracle, who's a few years older than me, really being influenced by the Black Panthers movement and William Whitney. So some of our great leaders and thinkers in the Indigenous community were really looking for guidance from the Black Civil Rights movement. I want to shift the conversation now a little bit into media, because this became a conversation about institutions, systematic racism, and institutional racism. And we started talking also about how media might be part of the problem and suffering from some of the same things. I know, Anita, you had mentioned you were talking about systems a minute ago, and I wanted to pick up on that and get you to reflect on why there isn't diversity in our media institutions.
I mean, I would flip that question back around to some establishment media institutions in our country and ask them that question. Because the civic case, the business case, and the moral imperative for diversity and inclusion has long been established, right? I can speak to that now if you'd like. Really, I mean, at the very baseline level, from a business case, uh, media institutions around the world, including in Canada, are losing money, they're losing resources. And as the advertising model has become less reliable in terms of generating sustainable revenue for media institutions, a lot of these organizations are pivoting towards membership and subscription. And those business models are actually incumbent on they depend on serving audiences properly with the stories that reflect their lives. So it's actually in a lot of media institutions' best interest to start expanding their audiences to serving new and underrepresented and diverse audiences, because it'll actually expand their revenue potential and their revenue sources. Beyond that, there's like the civic case and the democratic case. Media is a pillar of democracy. We're the fifth estate. We're supposed to hold political institutions accountable. And there's a lot of research that shows that if people don't have access to local news or news that reflects their daily lives, then they're less likely to civically engage, they're less likely to vote, and they're less likely to trust their neighbors, which is, just a hotbed for misinformation and polarization. So, and then finally, there's a moral imperative, obviously, humanizing people, understanding that telling stories and consuming stories from other communities will only just bridge understanding and bridge gaps. To me, this reasoning has been long been established. So at some point, enough conversation, you have all the information, just start taking action. The solutions have already been outlined as well, very clearly.
And Adrian, can you talk a little bit about the importance of diversifying newsrooms? What is it that BIPOC people bring to the table? Why should newsrooms be hiring us? Oh, I think you're muted, Adrian.
I would concur with everything that Anita said. I would just add that this is about competence. It's about professionalism, and it's about doing your job. If you are not reflective of the society, you're going to do bad journalism, period. You cannot cover, if you don't have people who know stories or who have the contacts or who are able to kind of see things in a complex, nuanced way, you're doing a disservice to the people that subscribe to you. You're doing a disservice to your listeners, to your viewers, to readers. You cannot tell a story in an effective way if you don't have people with that kind of knowledge, that kind of exposure, even that kind of interest or that kind of perspective. So just from in a very, very basic, the basic argument is that it's bad journalism, right? And you're not doing your job, and and it's a sign of incompetent leadership and a lack of understanding of what's actually required of a person in that, or or what's required of people in that position who are in decision-making positions.
And Brandy, as the out in the field working journalist freelancer, I wanted to get your opinions on that. I know that you've worked in some mainstream newsrooms, and you made a decision to go out and freelance. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, so I used to work with Karen at APTN National News. She was my news director, and actually I was supported by Journalists for Human Rights. Just wanted to let you know that. Great program. So I've been doing freelance for a number of years now, and a couple of years I was working for CBC Indigenous, and I just decided to step away. They had a great vision to tell the stories of our people by building this, this team of Indigenous journalists across Canada. But I felt like we were still kind of kept within the box of that corporation in regards to how we went about telling our stories. Maybe some of it had to do with because we were still, we were still doing the daily news kind of aspect to our stories. We didn't really have the opportunities to go too much in depth or, reach out and go in and explore our communities as much. So I felt that that was lacking. And I decided to leave. I decided that, to take that risk, to take that chance, to go freelance so that I could go deeper. Because a lot of media, like organizations, they don't have the resources. They don't have the understanding or the know-how that this kind of thing is needed in order to really give our stories justice, in order to really unearth all the stories that have never been told, that need to be told. It has to be done properly. It has to be done outside of the construct of what traditional, media does nowadays. So fortunately, I'm in a place where I'm able to do that right now.
And Anita, I want to I have to try to get this quote in. We're getting close to time, I think, where I see some questions coming in and I want to go to questions from the audience. But you wrote something in Policy Options that it just really hit me because, I mean, APTN started up, and I think for a lot of alternative media, we get very proud of our institutions. But you'd written, there are ethnic media outlets in Canada, but they're ghettoized into a two-tier system, where first, the establishment media is seen as more legitimate, and two, seemingly absolved from covering issues that matter to immigrant Canadians in an in-depth way. Can you speak to that a little bit? Like it really struck me. APTN's struggle to be seen as a legitimate news source was so long and so hard.
Yeah, absolutely. This is something that I think about quite a bit because I have a firm belief based on research and just my own lived experience that actually younger generations of Canadians, particularly those who are from communities of color, are very underserved by any sort of media because, there's establishment media that largely serves, like, let's be honest, middle-class white Canadians. And then there is, ethnic media that my parents watch. So things like Omni or, the local like Ming Pao newspaper. But that doesn't resonate with me as somebody who's born and raised in Canada. And my first language is English, right? So there's a different experience that you have when you're somebody who's like second or third generation that has not or has been inadequately reflected by major media organizations in this country. It has obviously improved over the last few years because of a lot of the grassroots efforts to basically, inform these organizations that they're not doing an adequate job, but definitely for me, that's what I'm referring to. There's this weird hierarchy in Canadian media where I remember being in journalism school and being told there were literally maybe 3 or 4 places that were the only places worth working. And that, to me, that kind of elitism has always struck me as so off-putting because as journalists, we're serving the public. I mean, there should be absolutely no elitism within journalism institutions, because you're like Adrian said, you're reflecting all of Canada. Your job is to serve the public. It's not to serve your own ego. And that is what I was referring to in that piece.
Okay, so I'm going to, we've got some people writing in some questions, and these are great questions. They're asking, how do we solve the problem? So I'm going to read a couple of those out, and I'll just let you guys jump in. The first question says, oftentimes organizations hire BIPOC only to pigeonhole them into specific areas. Black journalists asked to write about race, effectively reducing them to one aspect of their identity. How do we overcome such tokenism? Who would like to take that?
I could take that, but I want to make space for Adrian and Brandy if they want to go first.
Go ahead, Anita.
Okay, so this is something I think about all the time, and it's part of the reason why I actually moved to the US to work. So I worked in New York City and covered the US presidential election. So I was there from 2015 to 2017. And prior to that, I had worked at American media institutions since 2012 after leaving the Toronto Star. And a big part of that reason was because part of the impetus was because I really wanted to cover report on race relations. And there was just absolutely no room for that, even in 2011. And I'm not that old, I'm in my early 30s. So that is something that, so that relates to what I'm saying, relates to your question, because I think about how I'm treated in these two media ecosystems. And right now I'm still very connected. I still have a very large network in the US, still very connected to people because I sit in the Online News Association Board of Directors. And then I'm very much connected to the Canadian media ecosystem. And I'm called to speak publicly and do research in both ecosystems. And in Canada, I am almost exclusively called on to talk about diversity, even though my actual areas of expertise are audience engagement and revenue and media innovation. Diversity is something that I just feel very strongly about, that I need to talk about, just because it seems to be falling on deaf ears, or has been for a long time. So I want to be able to contribute to the movement. But in the US, my expertise is, and I don't want to be reductive about this, obviously this is specific to my experience in New York City, but I feel like I'm respected for my expertise. I oftentimes speak about audience engagement. I am consulting on Google's Project Oasis, which looks at building sustainable future for local news in North America. I'm part of a lot of cool, exciting projects that I don't have the opportunity to take on in Canada. So my answer to that person is actually, I've been very strategic about my career in order to be empowered. And it took a lot of thought on my part. And what I did was actually build a name for myself in the US and be able to basically associate myself with institutions like the Online News Association and City University of New York, where I also teach, that would basically establishes me as an expert in my field, even when my own industry doesn't necessarily has had a harder time accepting that. And that is like the most honest answer I will give, and have given actually on this. And you have to be really strategic. I really don't think there's like a linear path straightforward to the top of Canadian media unless you conform to certain things that may go against your own principles, or at least that's how I felt. And so I just, as a principled person, I just really wanted to do what I felt was right. And so that requires me to be a little more experimental in my approach to my career path. And that's something that I want to tell younger journalists, and especially journalists of color, that is possible, that the industry is changing, and that I'm very optimistic in spite of what we're discussing here today, in spite of the dragging of feet around diversity in this industry.
Does anybody want to jump in and just kind of play off that with solutions to diversify media?
Yeah, Karen, I'm not sure if this is what happens when you get close to 50, but I'm turning 50 this year, and so I'm starting to be a lot
Happy
really
birthday.
feeling old, but becoming just really reflective on the journey that I've taken to here. And I'm going to talk about something that I kind of kept close to my chest maybe over the last 15 odd years. But when I was first hired to be the afternoon host of the Drive Home show in Ottawa back in 2006, early on in my tenure, one of my colleagues suggested that my hiring was tokenistic, right? That I was basically hired because I was the Black guy from Ottawa who was going to be hosting the show. And I must say that I think as a result of that, and maybe other things as well, I felt a particular kind of pressure to demonstrate that I was competent in all kinds of different areas, and that I wasn't just a race hire, right? So I made a point, I think, of demonstrating that I could talk about sports, I could talk about literature, I could talk about history, I could talk about philosophy, whatever the case might be, whatever you put at me, I'm going to do it. And I made a point in particular of doing a lot of book fairs or with the Auto Writers Festival. You know, I was keen on demonstrating my range, right? And now I'm a bit resentful about that actually now, right? Because I feel as if I shouldn't have felt that way. I shouldn't have felt that I had to show my bona fides, that I had to show my competence. But I felt I needed to establish myself as a person who had range. Um, and I don't want the next generation to feel that way, right? I don't want them to feel that they have to do anything other than what their colleagues do, right? And your job when you're in this role is to be excellent. Your job is, like anything, your job is to do your best and to keep your eyes on that prize and to be ambitious and to just do good work, do good journalism. You shouldn't have to be worrying about how you're being judged or how you're being seen or whether people think you're actually capable. But I will admit that I was driven by that for quite a while, quite a long time. And I probably, was one of the busier people in the city because of that, right? Because I felt I needed to demonstrate that I could do it and that there were questions about my competence.
You know, I relate to that. I had a similar but different experience. I got started at APTN. If it weren't for APTN, I'd probably be a technical writer right now, because that's what I was doing. But that had something different to do than I think with Race. It was because I was trying to break in with Ottawa, and you know how Ottawa's a market that's very difficult to break into. But I spent 6 years at APTN, and I left there saying I spent a lot of time covering the Hill. I saw myself as somebody who had the skills of a Hill reporter. And when I went and I knocked on mainstream doors, all they saw was the Indian. And if they didn't have a job to cover Indigenous issues, they didn't consider the other work I'd done legitimate in any way. They didn't think I could ask questions or report on anything else. I mean, obviously, I did love reporting on my people, and I went back and made a career out of it. I did find other small agencies that would take me on and let me do other topics and explore other parts of journalism, but it was tough. Brandy, you're younger, I think, than either I or Adrian are. How have you found your career path, and what do you think needs to happen to diversify newsrooms?
Yeah, so I started out in the mainstream for the first few years, and I actually purposely worked to be able to solely, tell Indigenous stories and to create my own beat as a freelancer in this. So I wasn't as interested in mainstream. So it's different. It's different for me. I'm not out there, trying. I'm actually out there trying to get our stories to the mainstream and for them to take our stories seriously and, be interested in them, right? So it's on that level. I think for solutions that newsrooms should seriously look at investing in journalists, reporters of color and Indigenous peoples, investing in beats, investing in areas where they can solely focus on delving into and exploring the underreported communities here that we're talking about, to really be able to have the resources and the time to be able to do it. I just think that there's so much out there that needs to be told, that to help create these bridges, between our societies that Anita was talking to, right? Reconciliation on all these different levels, so that I just think that they should get the money if it's really important to them, as they say it is to do, get the people of color and Indigenous people hired, and get them out there in the communities telling the stories.
And I feel like I just want to talk a little bit about when you came to APTN, Brandy, because Brandy's a champion, right?
Oh no.
It was really hard to find Indigenous people even to work at APTN, because only 50% of our kids ever finished high school. By no means do all of them go on to university, to college, and most of them do go into legal and social work. Not so many journalists with that we're seeing more. So Brandy had applied for a job. She didn't have the technical VJ skills for it. And I offered her to come in as a paid intern. And if she could come in for 3 months, we would do that training with her. So I, first of all, I'd like to see more of that in mainstream offices, but just to show you how determined people are to get these jobs. She's a mom. She had to find care for her kids. She had to find a place to live. She brought her dog with her. She did a lot of personal sacrifice to be able to do those 3 months.
Prairies from Alberta to Winnipeg in the dead of winter in an old beat up red, barely running Pontiac and got my butt there.
So, I mean, if you make the space and you make the opportunities, I mean, people will do incredible things to take them. I'm going to go on to this.
Karen, can I just say one
please.
quick thing? I hope that people are listening to what you said, because your example is a model of what our leaders and what decision makers can do if they are intentional and if they have the will to do it. These things are solvable. This is not an intractable problem. We know how to solve the issue. We know what to do. And a lot of it is about opportunity. A lot of it is about support. A lot of it is about encouragement, mentorship. We have the tools to do it. It's a question of whether we have the will to do it and whether we have the decision makers, the people in positions of power with the vision and the actual commitment to making change and to actually having newsrooms that do reflect the diversity of the society.
Thank you for that, Adrian. I want to get to this question. This might be the one that we end on, but this is a great question. Thank you for sending this in. How can consumers of media challenge newsrooms to be more representative of the diversity in our society, both in the stories that are told and the people telling those stories? Who'd like to start out on that one?
I definitely.
Ada, yeah, we haven't heard from you in a while. Go for it.
So I think, change happens when there's internal and external pressure. Like every successful mass movement has had both pressure from internal and external sources. And I think the public can play a really positive role, and a big role in encouraging media institutions to change. So my organization, Canadian Journalists of Color, released 7 calls to action to strengthen newsroom diversity across the country. I encourage you guys to go to cjoc.net/white-paper to share and amplify those calls to action. Basically, email your favorite media institution, your regular news source to demand greater diversity at all levels of the organization, behind the scenes and in front of the scenes. And I would also say, beyond that, I would actually say to start subscribing and paying emerging media outlets, especially in this country, that are walking the walk. So there's a lot of cool places like The Discourse, where I used to work, places like the Narwhal, the Sprawl. There's like a burgeoning media ecosystem in this country that is building diversity inclusion into their foundation, which I think is the only way to go. Like, you cannot ghettoize diversity inclusion. It's not for committee. It should be institutionalized from the get-go. And so paying those organizations and allowing them to do journalism in a sustainable fashion is very positive. I also want to add one quick solution that I've encountered in my research, which I think is a really cool way to address this issue, especially for more under-resourced newspapers. So the Detroit Free Press is a publication that is in a city that's 80% Black. And they have largely served exclusively the suburban population of Detroit, which is largely white. So they're actually serving the 20%. So because management at that newspaper is well aware of this issue and well aware of how that's impacting polarization and democracy in the city, they actually partnered with an emerging media outlet called Bridge Detroit that just launched recently, that is fully staffed by, I think it's like 100% people of color. And they also have a community advisory board that is majority or either 100% people of color. And they are serving that 80%. And you specialize in community engagement. They specialize in basically working with communities to surface coverage that's relevant to their lives. And so this is an example of collaboration by an establishment organization and an emerging one to pool resources to basically properly serve the city of Detroit. So there's a lot of amazing kind of solutions coming up. that I don't even hear, you know, industry leaders in Canadian media discussing yet, which is alarming personally, because, you know, I'm not an establishment leader, but I'm aware of these things, so they should be as well. So I just wanted to put that out there, because there's a lot of cool solutions that are giving me a lot of optimism for the future of media.
Yeah, and in terms of audience, I don't know, Brandy, maybe you can comment. Like, I mean, I think there's been a pretty active Indigenous community on social media influencing the way mainstream media is covering our issues right now. Any thoughts on that, or any other thoughts?
Definitely. Well, I just totally align what Anita said with supporting new and emerging news organizations. As Adrian said, like these organizations, in my experience, they actually have that will and determination to do this. They have that interest. They just lack the resources. So subscribe, you know, $5 a week or whatever it is. That's how you're going to be able to get on board to help shift the narratives. So, so important. Again, social media, like you were saying, does play a role. We're in this era of social media, right? Where we have collective say and voice, you know, like never before. So in Indian country, or as we're seeing at the George Floyd movement here after, you know, his death, social media has played that role in all of these conversations that we're having right now, right? So we do have to take that into consideration in helping to create that pressure for what we want to be consuming.
And Adrian, I'm going to give you, the final word goes to Adrian.
And movements matter, and people, I think too often people underestimate the power that they actually have, the power that they have to make change and to influence what goes on within media organizations. The fact is, and I can speak specifically about CBC, that's the organization which I work, it's a public broadcaster. CBC is owned by the people of this territory, right? The people in this place we're calling Canada, they own the CBC. And so they have a stake in what occurs there. And they have, if they choose to, they can exercise their responsibility of voicing their concerns. And if they want to see things move, they can write a letter, or they can go on social media, or they can go into the streets. You know, there are all kinds of possibilities. There are all kinds of ways of influencing change. And I will say that I know that those in power will either choose to listen, or they'll be forced to listen. And citizens can force these powers, they can force organizations to listen, to pay attention.
Well, thank you so much. We're going to wrap it there. I want to thank everybody who sent in questions and everybody who did join us today. I'm sorry, I know there were a few questions I didn't get to, but we are out of time. And I do have to pass it back to JHR. They've got some closing remarks and some other exciting events that they want to tell you about coming up. Thank you, fellow panelists, for having this conversation with me today. Rachel.
Thank you, Karen, for your moderation.
Karen, it was great.
Yes. To meet you, Karen.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. Thank you, Karen, for your amazing job you did conceptualizing the questions and moderating. And thank you, Adrian, Brandy, and Anita, for sharing the leadership and these stories of courage. I feel incredibly inspired from this conversation to do much more to ensure that our media reflects the full range and richness of diversity in Canada. And to that end, please stay tuned for the community forums, the virtual circle events that Megan mentioned at the top of the hour from the Indigenous Reporters Program and JHR. And the next webinar in the Information Saves Lives series will take place in mid-August. Thank you for watching. Please donate if you are able, and stay strong. Thank you.